Hi, Easy here. Welcome to my December 12th class balance change patch note overview. This is only going to discuss the class balance changes and nothing more. And I'm going to be going over briefly over each of the changes that were made to each of the classes rather than go individually through every single skill and explain what changed. Because I believe everyone should be able to check what the skills are, check what the tripods are using cross-checking through character recognition. So if you want a more detailed description of what exactly changed for the class that you're playing, you can go ahead and take a look at the individual changes yourselves. I have a text file document available on Google with all of the changes translated. But other than that, I'll be going over every single class, what's been changed, like an overview of what's been changed, how it impacts their current standing in PvE, and what kind of where they can see themselves at in the future. So let's first get started with Berserkers. Berserkers got a lot of love this patch. They really did. Their damage has been increased pretty. It's not significant, but it's been increased enough to make a difference. But mostly they now have a party buff. They now have the on Red Dust, that skill that increase your crit chance by additional or damage by additional 20% tripod, now has a 50% party critical damage buff. So for your party will deal 50% more damage when they crit, and that is a pretty big buff. That is a really strong buff to the skill. Next up, we have some stagger changes, and most notably, Blood Rush. Your identity, Berserker's identity, has been made so that it staggers. It's extremely high now. It went from medium to extreme, so you can expect more stagger damage coming from Berserkers. And everything else just straight up damage increases. Berserkers were I believed Berserkers were in a decent spot before. Now they're even in an even better spot, and I think they are better than Devil Hunters in some cases. I'll have to see the exact numbers myself, but the fact that they bring a party buff now, when you combine that with a class like Battlemaster or Bard, means that you're gonna have a whole lot of damage coming through for your party. Warlords. Warlords weren't really touched too much. They were also buffed. They did get a small nerf in PvP in the form of removing the reduced enemy attack speed on the shield skill or something. If you're a warlord, you should know what I'm talking about. All of their base damage for a lot of their main DPS skills and some tripods have been buffed. It ranges from like 20% to 8.3% to 4.2%, etc., etc. So the base damage for a lot of your core skills have been buffed, meaning your PvE damage should be substantially, not substantially, but it should be notably higher, noticeably higher. All right. Destroyers also got a ton of love. Destroyers have been changed so that their cores, I believe it's part of your identity, their cores are more important and more damaging. A lot of their tripods that would reward cores on a chance had their chance buffed significantly, such as 20% to 75% or 20% to 50%, as well as having some of their tripods and damage, their skills in general, get base damage increases and some buffs to the tripod numbers. Destroyers, before the patch, were suffering a lot from damage. They had a ton of stagger. They had a ton of self survivability, but they struggled the most with damage. And now that the damage portion of it has been addressed, you can see your class. You can see Destroyers being one of the more favored classes. They're on par with Infighters now, I think, if not more. We'll have to see how big of a change this has been, but I think Destroyers are in a really good spot. Another thing to note is that their mastery scaling has been changed. So if you felt like your mastery didn't scale very well, check it out again, because their mastery scaling has been changed pretty significantly. It doesn't say how much, but it should be noticeable. Battle Masters didn't get nerfed, so that in itself is a buff. Battle Masters are in a pretty good spot previously, and now they're in an even better spot because a lot of their damage has been buffed. The most important one is probably this this skill right here, 방청격, which is the kicking skill, the really long animation, really hard hitting kicking skill. The damage amplification on the tripod that most people take for PvE has been increased by by 20%, 25%. So I've gotten some pretty crazy crits on some of the bosses so far. It hits really hard. I mean, obscenely hard now. So definitely worth looking at, and definitely a buff. Battle Masters are S tier in my eyes. Battle Masters are so good right now. Next up we have Infighters. Infighters, not much has been changed. Some of their yellow skills got buffs, in forms of just base damage, and one of their skills now takes 5 less yellow energy to cast. But overall, I would say the class itself is fairly unchanged, which is good because Infighters, I personally thought Infighters needed a little bit of nerf, especially in PvP. And speaking of that, they did get nerfed in PvP. The mana rune duration went from 8 seconds to 4 seconds, so 50% decrease in duration, and the mana regen reduction has gone from -75% to -50%. So it is a nerf, but I just wish they got rid of this rune in the first place because it's such an uninteractive and unfun mechanic to deal with for a lot of classes that I don't know why they kept it. Also, their health recovery on dashes has been increased or decreased from 2% to 1% if you take that rune. Mainly because what Infighters could do is they could take the legendary rune, the yellow rune that gave you another dash from getting 20 island hearts, and that would give you 6% healing on demand on like a 10-second cooldown, and that's way too oppressive. Soul Masters. So Soul Masters got a pretty decent buff. Their identity, the amount of damage that you get from using your identity, so the buff from your identity, has been buffed by a small amount. It went from 5% 1540 to 7.5 1845. So overall, it's a pretty big change, and considering a lot of your damage will come from when you're 45%, your third stage, and that will allow you to fit in more skills that are not fit in skills that deal way more damage than before. It might not seem like much because it's only 5%, but you have to remember that burst damage is really strong in this game, and having additional 5% more damage is just a huge buff across the board on all of your skills. Poison skill also has been increased by 31.8%, so I'm not sure if that makes it a more viable skill, but overall a lot of their buffs has been to some of the skills that weren't being used. So you guys might have to try out different skills and find a new build that fits in some of these buff skills if it's something that if the damage increase is something that's notable. They also had the foot stomp buff thing. The cooldown reduction node, the tripod, has been changed from 3-second reduction to 5-second reduction to make it align more with the bard buff. So you guys should be able to, if you're running with a bard as a soul master, you should be able to trigger it more often in sync. However, soul masters were in a pretty decent spot. They weren't being shunned like some of the other classes, but these changes leave me a little bit more to be desired. I think they needed a little bit more love because they currently lack any substantial identity within the current compositions. They're not a bad class. I'm not stating that they're a bad class. They just need a little bit more individuality, so to say. Summoners. Summoners were rather unchanged. What happened is they had a little bit of increased chance to gain identity bubbles on their little bird skill. They also had mana regen increase on the Spirit of Water tripod. It goes from 100% to 200%. And the Giant Spear skill has its attack speed tripod increase from 20% to 30%. I'll skip ahead to Devil Hunters as well. So Summoners and Devil Hunters. As you can see, it's very short. That's because Summoners and Devil Hunters did not need any additional changes to the current kit that they have. Summoners and Devil Hunters were kings and queens of PvE before this patch, and it is rightfully expected that they don't get changed. In fact, I expected some nerfs for Devil Hunters and a little bit for Summoners as well. However, seeing as that they're not nerfed, what that means is that they're in the spot that Smilegate wants them to be in. They are designed, they are pretty much done with balance at the current state for this patch for these two classes. And it shows that all of the other classes that got buffed are simply being brought up to the level of where Summoners and Devil Hunters are. So it's definitely a good change. I'm glad that they didn't change much for these guys. And I'm glad they're also buffing other classes. Arcana's got a lot of their defensive utilities buffed. Their base scaling on health and defense has been increased, and this is a huge deal because if you guys don't know, base scaling is pretty substantial when it comes to any form of video game. The fact that they got their base health scaling increased from 1.8 to 2.0 means that they will get that additional health benefit on ability stones as well. So it's a really big change. This will allow you to take one more hit than what you could before, and in a lot of situations, that one more hit is all you need to be able to survive a lot of encounters. They also had some parts of their damage increased, and the most notable ones, there's two really big ones. It's that their cards now have additional effects on some of them. So Ghost card has 15% chance to evade, and that will also increase your survivability. The Moon card has 20% mana recovery that's been added as well. So that increases your mana sustain, which will allow you to do more DPS over time. And the 80% damage buff or 80% damage reduction, 50-50 chance card has been reduced so that the damage buff is still 80%, but the damage decrease is now 20%. So what does that mean? It means that you'll be able to risk your chance at getting the 80% damage card during staggers a whole lot more consistently. Like, it won't be as punishing. It is still punishing because it's 20% damage reduction if you manage to pull that card out, but it isn't negative 80%, and that's what's big. Okay. Overall, if you use this card as soon as you get it, previously it was a net neutral card, meaning over the course of like a 20-minute fight, if you use this card as much as possible, then it was net neutral because it would it's 50-50. However, now it should be net positive because it's 80% damage increase on 50-50 and a negative 20% damage decrease on a 50-50, meaning there's a whole lot more damage increase overall than there is damage decreasing. So it should be a net damage increase. I think this is a sleeper. This buff is really substantial. Okay. The other point that's big for Arcanas is that they now have an additional 15% crit chance for the party for 3 seconds on the return skill. So normally you would take the return skill with the third tripod that makes you have 30% increased crit chance. That has an additional 15% crit chance for your party, meaning Arcanas get a 45% crit chance for 3 seconds on a 12-second cooldown, I believe, and the rest of the party gets 15% crit chance for 3 seconds. That bundled with the fact that the critical charm tripod on Spiral Edge, which makes you deal like 70% more critical damage, has been changed from 3 seconds to 4 seconds, means that your damage and your critical damage will be more streamlined and more consistent throughout the fight, and meaning you'll be doing way more damage than what you might expect from just seeing the patch notes. They also had a lot of their skills increase in stagger, and they also had their mana control, like mana sustain, be better. So overall, Arcana's got a ton of love. They got a lot of their weaknesses fixed, which was mainly their defensive capabilities, and they also has a party utility that might not be as strong as Battle Masters or Bards, but it is more than nothing, right? Bards got a lot of love in terms of self damage. So if you are struggling to do tower, if you're struggling to solo dungeons, you should have a much better time. They did get nerfed in terms of defensive utilities, but that was to be expected, and nothing's gonna change because the nerfs weren't that substantial, right? The shielding amount goes from 30% to 25%, no big deal. It's not that substantial, and the damage reduction from that final skill that you get, a level 50 skill, has gone from 65% to 50%. So this is probably much bigger than the shielding one. But overall, this skill was way too strong in the first place. So it's pretty much expected. I expected them to nerf this. It was warranted. So overall, they got a ton of damage buffs, and they also got a little bit of a utility nerf. But definitely, they're in a really good spot. They're in a really good spot. Devil Hunters, like I mentioned, just some PvP changes. Nothing too substantial. And Blasters. Blasters got a little bit of love in terms of their damage output. Unfortunately, they didn't get too much in terms of utility, as in mobility and some party buffs. But I believe they are still very strong. A lot of people's opinions on Blasters has changed from who the hell plays this class to wow, Blasters are really good, I want them. And now it should be wow, Blasters are doing a ton of damage. What the heck? They're doing everything, right? So Blasters in a really good spot. They are very, very strong. If you don't play Blaster, then it might not seem like much, but the identity going from 15 seconds to 20 seconds gives you a ton of flexibility as to when you can turret up and when you can start using turret skills. And some of their strong skills got buffed, like Flamethrower, and some of their not so commonly used but more punishing skills, such as Howitzer and Airstrike, has been buffed as well, pretty substantially, 15% and 17.5%. And the over the laser, like the multi-rocket skill, has been buffed pretty substantially as well, so it might be usable now. So overall, Blasters got a lot of damage buffs. I just wish they were a little bit more. They touched up on some of their main weaknesses, being the mobility. Just like 8 seconds, making the cooldown go from 10 seconds to 9 seconds, or making the roll a little bit faster, might have been enough. But it is what it is. Blasters are still really solid. They're really strong. Lastly, we have Hawkeyes. Hawkeyes overall, the death mark has been changed from 5 seconds to 6 seconds. I think that is a lot bigger of a deal than what it might initially seem. Especially when you pair it with the fact that Smokescreen Arrow has its duration increased from 4 seconds to 6 seconds. What does that mean? It means that when you take the tripod, that increases your damage by 40% on a target that's affected by the Smokescreen Arrow. You can fit in all of your really hard-hitting skills like Snipe and Charge Shot within that 40% increased damage window, and that is massive. That is such a huge damage change and such a huge playstyle change that you're gonna see a ton of really, really bursty damage come from Hawkeyes. And I think it's a really good change. I think Hawkeyes were already in a solid spot. They were competitive with Devil Hunters, but Devil Hunters just outshined them, mainly due to their damage ceiling. But even when you go to later rates, like tier 2, even tier 2 and into tier 3, being a melee and finding uptime for melee players, and Devil Hunters are technically melee in shotgun stance, becomes harder and harder. And Hawkeyes don't need to be in melee range in order to do their damage, so a lot of the output has been increased, meaning they're very, very competitive with Devil Hunters, even more so than they were before. Hawkeyes didn't get any substantial party buffs. However, that shouldn't push them away from being good in parties. I run with a Hawkeye myself in my party. It's pretty insane how much damage he can do with proper skill sets and proper support. So closing thoughts. Overall, this is exactly what I expected. Um, and this is exactly what I wanted. More importantly, mainly because it shows that Smilegate knows how to um, take patch notes in a good direction and class balance in a good direction. They didn't nerf anything too substantially. They nerfed all the aggregate, really offensive changes that were honestly should have been hotfixed. So they did address some of that. But the fact that they brought up all the low standing characters up to where the high standing characters are, means that they know that nerfing classes just feels bad. And I'm glad that they did what they did in terms of all the damage buffs. What does it mean for power creep? It's okay, you don't have to worry about power creep because for the most part, the damage scaling in this game doesn't really make it so that it's out of control. If you notice, you do the same amount of damage through appropriate bosses at item level 400 as you do when you're item level 300, and that's because of defense scaling and stat scaling on enemy monsters. So you don't really have to worry about, oh my god, the damage is gonna go out of control. It's probably not. They can always increase the boss's HP, boss's defenses, whatever, in order to counteract some of these buffs. But all of this is doing is making sure that every single class feels good when they play. It feels good when you find parties, and it feels good when you're actually in encounters and in parties. Overall, you guys can throw out whatever tier list you had in your mind. All the DPS classes, so Hawkeyes, Berserkers, not blasters, Hawkeyes, Berserkers, Summoners, Arcanas and Berserker. No, I said Berserkers. Summoner, Hawkeye, Berserker, Arcana, Devil Hunter. All 5 of those classes should be somewhat similar in strength now, so you guys can feel safe. Be happy that you rolled an Arcana or you rolled a Berserker or Hawkeye, whatever. Be happy that you are now much in a much better spot than before. And Devil Hunters and Summoners, don't feel bad that you didn't get buffed. You were still strong, and you were strong before. You had your glory days, but now let's share the throne of DPS kings and queens with other classes. All right. That has been the class overview, or the balance patch overview, and some analysis, as well as my personal thoughts on where classes stand now. Everything should be balanced somewhat decently, or in a better spot than it was before. I'm not saying the balance is perfect, but it is much better, and I think it's very strong right now. Balance is pretty solid. We'll have to see how big of a change some of these changes were, and if there are any really unexpected strengths or weaknesses on some classes. But that has been the patch notes. I'll leave all of this out, the translations and stuff, on a Google document like I mentioned, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'll have the other part of patch notes on a different video as well. So I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.